one of the promises of AI from an investing standpoint, in terms of what's the business model, who are the winners going to be, is this sense of abundance potentially in terms of what it can achieve.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you have this like sort of, you have this early days of the internet. You would just have this and use these metaphors to get there, but you have these like sort of sense that you've discovered a new land, right? And that there's an entirely new world that's opened up, and that you can build whatever you want in that new world, right? And then on the flip side is that you have some real constraints in terms of what you can do, what you're capable of doing with technology, what you can do, what capital you have, all those constraints. And so like balancing those things is like sort of one of the key jobs of the entrepreneur. But it's also, it is always, them keeping in mind sort of the higher order, like sort of like, why am I here? What am I actually building? I think is absolutely central to, ending up building things which matter and building things which change the world.
John Borthwick, thanks for talking to us today.
Pleasure.
I want to do a little bit of this is your life, so let's go all the way back and just sort of ask you real quick: were you a computer kid growing up? Were you into tech and gadgets and things like that?
I was a nerd. I was a computer kid. I did my first bit of programming on a computer, which included a tape cassette.
Mm.
And I would never say that I was a programmer. As I grew up, I sort of ended up sort of scripting more, sort of like figuring out how to cobble together and use computer code to make one thing do something else. And you know, I grew up in the UK, half English, half French. Not a lot of exposure to computers or nerds, but gravitated towards them whenever I could. Had a sort of very creative family, so a lot of stuff on the arts, and so between nerds and arts, I kept myself busy.
I sometimes ask people their first computer, like the one that made them fall in love with computing or whatever. And so, since you just said UK Europe, like, can I ask you that question? Like, was it a Sinclair, a Commodore? Like, what was your first
It
computer
was a
that made you?
Commodore. It was a
Yeah.
Commodore, but I did not love it.
Well,
I mean, yeah,
go.
the first computer I loved, which was not mine, but I was when I was in college. I was at college, went to Wesleyan in Connecticut, and somebody there on my in my dorm got one of the early Macintoshes, and I just loved that. And so the combination of the design, the GUI, the everything from the keyboard to I can still remember the clutch, and the feel of the keyboard, and a little happy guy when you boot it up.
At Wesleyan, you studied economics, is that right?
Economics and art history.
I was an
Yeah.
art history minor, but economics is often a major that folks say, in retrospect, if I could have done that, like that would have been very useful. What about studying economics has sort of informed
So
your work?
so Brian, I did development economics.
Explain what that is
So
then.
basically the um you know like USAID.
I got it. So
Yeah,
essentially, uh,
economic development and how development happens across different geographies and different countries, and how countries, how they trade, how they relate to each other. So it was very much that. I had no interest in like accounting or
mm,
a balance sheet or understanding sort of the that side of economics. I did some of that later when I went to Wharton, went to grad school at Wharton, and I did some of that there.
Wharton was an MBA.
Did an
Yeah.
MBA at Wharton, went to Wharton. I was kind of a fish out of water there because, mostly finance people, got a few nerds, but I enjoyed it. I spent a bunch of time in the computer science department down at Penn and did some classes there. and I met my wife there, which was the best thing that, for me, that came out of one. And then in '94, I was graduating, summer of '94. And in spring of '94, I want to say February, March, a friend of mine who was working at the AI uh, lab up at MIT, so not the media lab, there was an AI lab back in '94. And he said, "Hey, we just wired up we got a computer that's on the World Wide Web, and you can come see it." And so I drove to Boston to see the World Wide Web because couldn't find, there has to have been a terminal I've had somewhere, but we're talking about, I think it was an SGI
Hmm.
box.
Hmm.
And so I drove about, whatever it was, 5 hours to Boston to sit down, and I went to a few websites, including the Web Louvre, if you remember that,
Yes.
and Nicolas Pinoche, if I
What
remember right.
what was that?
Nicolas Pinoche was the guy who curated the Web Louvre. Um,
Right. So
yeah.
essentially, the Louvre put pictures at this point because I did they even have video for that first site? Anyway,
Oh my gosh, no, it was
right.
not. It was, and it
Exactly.
was not the Louvre. It was this guy Nicolas, who was a nerd in Paris, and he was just like, "I love the Louvre, so I'm going to put this up on." And the images kind of like took, you know,
Hmm.
about 4 minutes to render on this big SGI
And
box,
we're
and
postage stamp sized.
were, yes, were tiny in the middle of the page. And I drove back to Penn that night, and I had sweaty palms on the way down because I felt I had seen the future, and that it would be that, I needed to like drop out of school, and I needed to just get going because it was going to happen. It was right in front of us, and I was right, but took a bit of time.
It,
So
hadn't you done some consulting or something a little bit?
I did some between undergrad, between Wesleyan and Penn undergrad. I did consulting with a sort of quant firm here in New York. It's called Oliver Wyman, and I ended up doing a bunch of sort of computer work or data modeling work for them. They were very quantish,
So
but these were on PCs, so it was not quant as they call it.
not with the AI and deep learning and stuff. That so we're talking about the 94, 95-ish era. So this is still dial up and the web is extremely nascent. We're not even in close to like the dot-com bubble era, but you are in New York at this point?
I'm in New York. I'm in New York. I graduate from Wharton. I I can, if you're interested, I just
Yeah.
remembered it's downstairs. I can go get this artifact. But I so I'm in New York, and I want to start a web company.
Hmm.
And I went to the World Wide Web symposium, which was packed with a whole bunch of it was, I believe, in Illinois. It was packed with a whole bunch of engineers and researchers. So we're talking about like very, very early days.
Hmm.
No, not seeing the what do I learn? Yes, I found it. Boom.
Let's see. Ah, the I'm going to say for people listening, it's the WWW Conference 94 Mosaic and the pull out a bit. Mosaic and something something Mosaic and the Web Advanced Proceedings Volume 2.
Yeah, I no longer have volume one. And so yeah, and so this was the second international World Wide Web conference. And so did that. And yeah, the other thing I want to show you, you're going to edit this, right, Brian?
Not for the Internet
Yeah.
History podcast, but for some of the
Okay.
other stuff, sure.
Yeah, because while I'm down here, I just want to show you this. So, like, one of the things that was crazy at that period was that, some of the magazines, and this
Mm.
was PC computing, thought that they could draw a map of the web
Hmm.
because, like, navigation, as you think through sort of early metaphors and like how you like how you get around this world was like a question that people asked early on.
Like the map
So
metaphor. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh,
So
wow.
there's map of we've got actually two of them here, and these are from '94. I I left my glasses upstairs, but like Yahoo was on there.
Hmm.
I can send you a photo if you're interested. But Yahoo's on there, but it's not yahoo.com. It's their Stanford
Stanford
graph.
account. And by the way, Yahoo wasn't even a search engine at that point. It was just a directory. So again, continuing the sort of like the analog metaphors of maps and directories as opposed to even what we would think of as search now.
Correct, correct. And I think that, one of the patterns that I've seen through, the world of technology and the world of startups, and, just as we've gone through sort of, cycles from, the internet to mobile to AI, is just, how uh, incredibly stubborn we are as humans, to want to see something new through the metaphors of something old.
Um, can I come back to what New York is like in 94, 95? Is there a sense, and I'm not even saying is there a sense that there's a tech scene happening, but is there a sense that something is happening around technology? Are there people, artists, media folk, whatever? Is there like a sense that there's a new era dawning?
Yeah, so there was a ton of activity happening on the left coast, right? And so, or like starting to bubble on the left coast, and we were starting to see pieces of it, shades of it in New York, right? So I graduated, came back to New York, came to New York, and I had like a flow of people coming through my apartment wanting to see the internet. And a bunch of them would come by and wanted domain names, or like were like, how can I get how can I get a piece of turf here?
By the way, how are
Um,
you serving up the internet to them? Are you dialing in somewhere, or do you have a
yeah,
T1 line or something?
no, 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 no.
Yeah.
What was the not PipeX? It was a thing called Pipeline, which was it's one of the early ISPs.
Hmm.
Yeah, I managed, but we're talking about modem and we're talking about dial-up, right? And so that I managed to get Panix. Do
Mm.
you remember Panix? PNIX,
No.
early New York ISP.
Hmm.
So anyway, so managed to get connectivity. Um, a lot of people in the what I would describe as the sort of nerd creative community in New York starting to get interesting and sort of doing sort of informal meetups, people, friends getting together and like trying to figure out, what is this thing and how can we start things, right? I think quite a few people, given the depths of experience that New York has in the sort of, media advertising agency world, quite a few people in that world, starting to think about it because starting to think about, okay, how does this relate to media and everything that relates to that? People in, I think people in publishing probably less so, but a bit. And then creative people. So, and I gravitated very much towards, I felt like, I thought at the time, this is a fundamentally new medium and that we are I'm naturally gonna like put my assumptions, we're calling it web pages, we're talking about navigation, we're doing all the things that like are suggestive that we sort of know and understand what this medium is. But I was like, this thing is just it's just an alien thing that is completely new. And so I thought that that what we should do is what I wanted to do initially was work with creative people to create creative projects on the internet. And so the very first thing I did was a site which I started working on, which was called Web, named after Ada Byron, Ada Lovelace Byron. And
Let me
Ada,
just spell that out for people listening. ADA web,
W,
ADA web. Yes.
ADEAWEB.com. It's still actually around because we ended up giving it to the Walker Art Museum. And so it still sort of functions, which, many of the commercial things I ended up doing after that no longer are around. But the first thing I did was AutoWeb. And so the principle of AutoWeb was very simply, we were going to work with artists and put an artist and an engineer together and see if they could make something. So the first artist that I wanted to work with was a woman called Jenny Holzer, and Holzer. And Jenny's work, which is, I loved her work. I had no idea how to get to her, but I thought her work was fascinating and brilliant. But she worked with language, right? If you look her up, she like puts these like she puts what she has a series that she refers to as truisms, which are sort of like very short sentences that are highly provocative and that she puts in public places. So
Sort of like Barbara Kruger a little bit.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, she would say different.
Yeah. Not to
But
be
yeah,
not casting
yes,
aspersions.
yeah,
Sorry.
yes, yeah, artists do. So um I mean, here is, I remember seeing her project that she did in Times Square,
Hmm.
which I can, you know, we just drop in the chat room. Yeah. But I thought her work was brilliant. And because it was sort of so, um, uh, because it was just text, I thought this can actually work, given the limitations of the internet at the time. So anyway, so I just I I think I tried Kruger too, but I thought, okay, I'm going to try and get her phone number. We'll try. So I managed to, through somebody, get her phone number, and I called her up, and I spoke for about 15 minutes and told her that I wanted to do an internet project. And she said to me, she said, young man, I have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. But she said, if you drive upstate, I will cook you chili and you can show me your internet. So packed up a car, rented some modems, and went upstate and showed Jenny the internet. And then we ended up creating a project with her. We then ended up making about 15 other projects. And then after about 6 months, I started the first commercial thing. So that was kind of the early days for me.
Was the first commercial thing that was Total New York, or
Yes. Yeah.
yes?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Ex,
So I
ex,
started just thinking
yeah.
about local information and like getting around. And so, yeah,
Again, well, hey, the navigation metaphor.
gain
So
navigation.
so
Yes. Yeah.
explain a little bit what Total New York was.
Yeah. So we started Toll New York. We really started it a few months later. So it started at the end of 94. And then I think, I mean, I found a bunch of things in the scrapbook. I think we went live in early 95. But Toll New York, really the inspiration behind Toll New York, or the idea behind Toll New York was there is there's going to be, when I grew up in London, there was Time Out, and I was like, there has to be a great site around New York City. And so, we started building Toll New York, and I got together with a small team. And we ended up taking the same office as the Ottawa people, so we did it together. And then I very quickly sort of like started thinking about this as a studio. And so, in a funny sense, I mean, it sort of is, there's, as my wife says, there's a lot of like underpinnings of Betaworks because, from the very outset, I was trying to create sort of a studio-like atmosphere where we could have several different things that we were building, and Total was a local news content information site.
It is interesting, like that. This again, we're using metaphors, studios, like with the arts and how you're experimenting, throwing things against the wall, as opposed to like this idea of an incubator, which is sort of we'll come back to that. Let me seg through some things a little
Um,
bit. Like
but
you,
I would also say, just to sort of ground that, right?
yeah.
Or to like take that a bit further, right? So with Total New York, right, we started up and there was this small team with Guy Garcia and with Ted Were and this guy Deoresi, and we got together and started building this sort of first version of it. And this woman Janice joined the crew, and so we were sort of this motley crew of creative technologists who were really interested in like figuring out how media, how stuff about New York, but how media would be in this thing. And so, and we had to figure out how to make this stuff pay for itself. And we had to figure out how we could actually get people interested in the web and going to this website. So not only did we have to like make the website compelling, we had to make the web compelling.
Mm, mm,
And so, a lot of the early things we did at Total New York were actually sort of content, but they were experiments, parentheses, stunts to be able to get people to use the internet.
mm,
And so, like we did in 95, 96, we did this idea where we said, let's do a road trip from Silicon Alley to Silicon Valley. And so we found this guy, Greg Allen. We put a camera on his helmet. We put a laptop on his motorbike, and he drove from Silicon Alley to Silicon Valley. And on the way, he stopped creating a daily journal of interviews with people who were critical in creating the internet. So, like, he went to, I think, DARPA and met with Ray Tomlinson, who
mm,
created the at sign,
mm-hmm,
and interviewed Ray and wrote a post, a blog post, not known as a blog post back then, a journal post, because he was writing a daily diary of the internet.
mm-hmm.
And so, and what happened was the traditional media people followed this because they were like, this is crazy. And it also helps us explain the internet to people. And we were like, it helps tell people why they should get on the internet. And then hopefully they'll come to our website too. So you could see that it was kind of it was an amazing time. It just felt so like open and free and creative, and like you could like cobble together anything, and people were doing things dirt cheap. People were just like figuring stuff out. It was just it was so it was an amazing creative time. And it was also a time where you had to like you had to justify the whole stack.
Well, I was going to say not only that. I mean, we can get into like the technological roadblocks that you have to hurdle, but it seems to me that one lesson there is it's a product that you have to educate the user on not only how to use but why they want to use it. And number two, there would be a lesson there about distribution, which what I was going to get to was I think you get acquired by AOL or digital AOL Digital City or something around this time, and that would be a lesson of like they at the time have distribution for doing the things that you're talking about, like getting the audience that you're looking for. I don't know if I even formed a question there, but tell me about the lessons of like that, of like teaching, finding the audience, but also teaching the audience why they need it, and then distribution.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think the distribution at the the highest level distribution for the actual internet, right? Because what we did is we ended up building up Tony New York. We had whole bunch of content on it. We had some sort of what I would describe as directory-based content, but it was a lot of content. And we did a lot of these events, right? So I described the Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley thing. We did another thing where we did, I think, the first mayor to mayor, the mayor of Boston, the mayor of New York. So Giuliani was mayor of New York. And we worked with Sun Microsystems and did a sort of a see you, see me, direct conversation, public conversation between the mayors of the two cities. Again, a stunt to illustrate the internet. Eric Schmidt was over at Sun Microsystems then, and he was the sort of at St. Mark's Cafe, which we wired up a terminal there. And he showed up, but Giuliani ended up not showing up. So we had the mayor of Boston sitting there with Eric Schmidt, and it was um, fun and interesting and weird. So we did a lot of these events and these things to try and get people to both understand the internet and to start using the internet and start building the company, seeing if we could make some money, right? Because these events were also ways that sponsors and advertisers could sort of understand how it would make sense for them to back an internet project. It was definitely coming from experimental ad budgets, but it was before there was any sort of quantification of clicks or even really demonstration of ad banners, right? I mean, I think so. Fast forward to the AOL acquiring us. So AOL bought us, and us being the whole company, right? The studio, which we called Web Partner Studios, WP Studio. And so at that point, we had Total New York, we had ArtWeb, and then we had created a third thing that was called Spanker. That was a daily blog where we had a very creative writer who would basically, as they said back, or they say back in England, take the piss out of somebody on the internet. And so basically take a GeoCities page and write a piece of editorial around it, spank it.
In the Gawker era, they call that snark, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It was very snarky and fun, but I had to explain that because if not, your listeners may leave with it was. They bought AOL bought it, and it was about distribution. It was about distribution, and it was about capabilities around local, right? The early days of the internet, you certainly noticed, but we went through these waves of, okay, the internet's going to change everything. Okay, the internet's going to change commerce. The internet's going to change how people get around. The internet's going to change local. And so there was these sort of waves of interest, or sort of peaks. Everybody thinks about the internet wave. The initial internet wave was the capital of interest as being just one thing, but it was really all like it's a fractal sort of, there's all these little peaks in there. And so there was a ton of interest, which went on for about a year in local. And so there was a thing called City Search, and the AOL guys who had, done, were a terrific on-ramp to the internet themselves. They had not done a lot in local, so they showed up and they said, "Hey, we want to do a big local thing. Want to buy you guys. Want to make you the anchor site, and then have you, John, and the team help run the digital cities thing, which was their local thing."
I want to point out again for historical context that one of the metaphors is, geography in 30 years on, the web kind of blew that up, the internet blew that up, but the analogy at the time was things like the Yellow Pages, which was a $20 billion industry, or so. Things like, again, directories, but local guides and things like that. There was a sense that you could replicate this on the web as well. And that's sort of what you were experimenting with and poking at?
Yeah. That was happening very much at the time. Elon never came by Total New York, but his brother Kimball came by.
I want to point out that Elon's first startup was something like this, like a local directory site thing. Yeah.
And do you remember who he sold it to?
It was Zip2 Compact, the computer
computers.
Yeah. Zip2 was the company. Yeah, look that up, everybody.
Why would a computer company buy that? It was crazy, right? But it was getting distribution, right? It was like sort of like the idea. It's like AT&T buying Time Warner, right? Or Time Warner buying AOL. It's kind of like the same sort of like people trying to go up and down the stack and like control distribution and content and media.
Can you give me a little bit of color about AOL? Just so AOL, again, for historical context, was like sort of the first big internet behemoth, even if it didn't last. But there was a period where AOL, again, as a sort of meeting of tech and media, was the biggest game in town. Bought AOL Time Warner around the year 2000. It's like, okay, this is the future, right? Right before the bubble's about to burst. But I think you worked there even after the bubble's bursting. So give me a sense, even with a New York City lens, a little bit of what AOL was like to work for, what they were trying to do, anything like that.
Yeah, yeah. So I ended up staying at AOL for a couple of years. I thought I would stay for a couple of months, right? I was just like, I was keen to do the, figure out how, you know, we ended up deep in negotiations with TCI, and they wanted to buy it, and they kind of like dumped us at the altar. And AOL, we also knew. And so we ended up doing a deal with AOL, but it sort of, as a startup and with startup founders, you put yourself in the mode of, okay, we're going to exit. And the whole team and everybody's kind of in that mode. And it becomes hard to like click out of that. So we ended up doing this deal with AOL. I joined AOL, thought I'd stay for a few months. Always worked at AOL from New York, so remained part of and built the New York office, but part of the team. Went down there a lot. So there was Virginia, was Reston and
Mm-hmm.
Tyson's Corner, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
The AOL team, like when I first went down there, it was still fairly young, but it was Steve Case, was at the helm of AOL. And Steve had built AOL as this, he had a sort of vision of an online, almost gaming network, and it
It
was
literally
almost
was
like a
it literally
toy.
was a dial-in gaming company at some point in its life. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, and and they introduced email early on. So they had native email embedded in there. Email and chat rooms became incredibly sort of, word back then was sticky, right? They became sort of these retention vehicles. And so then they grew out the team, and I ended up working with a guy called Ted Leontis, who's still around and who's like built a big sports empire down in DC,
Mm-hmm.
with Barry Schuler and with Bob Pittman. So, when Pittman came on board, really, I think Steve and the AOL team sort of had this insight or believed that, okay, we got this internet thing, or we got this dial-up game thing. People are spending a lot of time on email, a lot of time on chat. There's this internet thing when people get onto our thing, they use that connectivity to open up the internet thing. So let's see if we can bring the internet into AOL, right? And there was sort of this brief period of like probably 2 years where it felt like AOL could be the internet. And then the internet ended up becoming, bigger than AOL, and there were lots of other ways to get into the internet. And so I think that was sort of peak AOL hubris was AOL can be the internet. And Bob Pittman, he was, part of his genius was he was a media person, and he was like, okay, you've got all these people who are looking at this thing, let's channelize it. And Bob and Ted and Barry and the team basically created these media channels and said, okay, when people come and check their email, they want to go to some news. Let's put news here. They want to go to sports. They want to go to the classifieds, as you were saying, just category by category. Let's see if we can turn this into a media experience
But there's
and
another metaphor
monetize that.
there of channels. So
Yes,
TV. Yeah.
channels and TV. Also metaphors of radio, like seeping in there. But yeah, a lot of TV. Yeah. And these guys were media guys. But Bob and the media guys came from New York, and the telecom guys really were down in Virginia. So it was kind of a culture clash even then a bit, but that sort of accelerated once we acquired Time Warner.
Um, uh, AOL folks were known. Cowboys is a term that is thrown around. Those Virginia folks. there were some sharp elbows thrown in terms of like, the legend is that you were a startup, you would raise $100 million or something, and you'd give it all to AOL. Anything about the AOL culture and like compared to like let's say startup culture and stuff like that today?
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think that the AOL culture was very much a culture, sort of, what I would describe as media slash business development, and it was not a technology-driven culture. And I think even when people like Andreessen, he doesn't talk, he was briefly the CTO over there a while. And people from the West Coast or people who were sort of steeped in engineering culture, like found that pretty, sort of jarring and just it was very much a business culture, business driven culture, deal culture, deal cowboy, and very much in sort of like run fast, get shit done kind of culture. You're alluding to sort of these sort of round trip deals that the AOL team did. We did with, a lot of, up and coming startups, so the Amazons or the eBays of the world, or the, um, any of the pet.com or like any of these sort of category based startups, we go to them and we'd say to them, e-toys, we'd say to them, hey, you want more distribution? Why don't we invest in you? And you invest in some distribution. Basically, you take some piece of the investment. And it was usually a large piece, but not 100%, Brian. And you come back and buy services from us or buy placement from us. So on one hand, you can go, that's really fucked up. Uh, yes, and take a look at Anthropic and OpenAI
Mm,
and the round trip deals. Microsoft puts $1 billion into OpenAI.
mm.
And part of that comes with a round trip deal to buy X amount of compute on Azure. And so, this stuff is, the music's still going.
One more thing on this sort of era. When the dot-com bubble burst, I was here in New York City at that point, and I remember a sense of, especially in media and other industries, oh, phew, that I'm glad that fad is over. But then there were other folks that were like, that fad's not over. No one's stopping using the internet. So, your sense of the nuclear winter of the bubble bursting, and then the tech resurgence.
Yeah. Yeah. So, uh, at the time, I was still within AOL, so I'd stayed, and then I ended up after the merger with Time Warner, and there was one cycle of management. I ended up moving over to Time Warner and taking the CTO's job there, and so I sort of had a very different sort of view, of the or approach to like see the world. Look, my view is that the internet was just getting going. None of this was stopping, but it was brutal in New York for the startup community because the startup community didn't have a lot of like depth to it. So, and a lot of people, a lot of companies shut down, and there wasn't any sort of there weren't jobs or alternatives for them to do other than go back into traditional media. And then, as you're alluding to, right, like media has always had this really complicit relationship with the internet, which is both hey, you're new and interesting, I want to write about you, but also you may be the seeds of my demise. So anything bad that happens to you is something I want to write about in particular. And so, there were a lot of, I mean, the other thing is that, sort of there's always a sort of dialectical sort of like, once you've told the sort of, vision story of the internet, the next story you need to tell is the takedown story, right? It's just like, so, the pendulum just sort of swings in the media narrative. And so the media narrative I think, was all too happy with that this was sort of the end of that pesky little internet thing is gone right away.
In terms of the next era of what the internet and the web becomes, can I jump to Photolog, which is sort of in the social era of what technology is becoming? give me a little bit about Photolog, and then let's jump to
Yeah,
Beta
yeah.
Loop.
So I had stayed. I even when I was even when I took the CTO's job at Time Warner, I was very involved with. I stayed plugged into the New York tech community as much as I could, and I did that through friends, hanging out, learning. I also did that through a bit of an angel investing, and so I became an angel investor in Prolog. Scott Heifman started up Prolog. He basically, Scott was an old friend, and he had done iTraffic, which was an early sort of agency.
Hmm.
And then I got together with him, and he said, "I've got two ideas. One's called Prolog, one's called Meetup." And I had also done a seed investment in Blogger, which was Ev Williams' startup,
Hmm.
and so I was totally fascinated in publishing, in self-publishing, in these, because go back to that Silicon Valley experience, right? This idea of daily publishing was an idea which really fascinated me, and distributed publishing, and then later, fast forward at Betaworks, we became early. We were very early in Twitter, so you can see the themes like tying together and emerging, from the early days. So Photolog was an idea that Scott had, which I thought was wonderful, and was to basically post a single photo every day. And it was a social network for photos. This was before there was Instagram, before there was mobile browsers, before there was iPhones. This was very, very early on. And Scott got his friend Adam Seifer, who I also knew, and Adam was from 6 Degrees, which was one of the
Oh
early.
yeah, I've never spoken to anyone at 6 degrees. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So Adam Seifer and Wine Andrew Andrew Weinrich, I think, were
Yes,
the
that
two
sounds right.
founders.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's amazing how you remember this stuff. And so Adam Seifer stepped in and started working with Scott and started building Prolog. And I, wrote a C check, and I was fascinated with it. Fast forward, Prolog became a huge phenomena in Brazil. Like you would, Adam went to Brazil, and there were like kids wanting him to sign. They didn't have mobile phones back then, but sign something, like give him an autograph. I mean, it was just like it was a cultural phenomenon in Brazil and in South America. It did not become a cultural phenomenon in the US because it got eclipsed by Flickr. And Flickr had a lot of the same properties, but Flickr would let you post multiple photos every day.
Hmm.
And so, but the one photo every day was both a sort of a limitation on the costs, but it was social design. It was much more that. It was basically, Brian, kill one photo today that
Curate,
really matters to you.
curate it.
Curate. And there was also the beginning of a photograph there.
Hmm.
And so the idea of having, you know, I wouldn't want to see all my friends' Flickr photos every day in a feed, but there was the beginning of, again, metaphor feed, and beginning of sort of like reverse cron feed, that blogging idea starting to come together and take shape. And so, yes, that was Photo.
But it's interesting. You suggested that that was also motivation for that was the constraints that you're working under in terms of bandwidth or costs and things like that. It's always interesting to me what constraints like force in terms of creativity forcing and things like that. Let me jump to Betaworks.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, Brian, I would say really interesting about creativity.
Please.
So much creativity comes out of those constraints. And so you look like what Josh Harris was doing at Pseudo in those early days, right? That I would go down to like the place on Broadway, and you could see with there was so little throughput of bandwidth, but you could have this idea of living in public. So the concept was very clear, but you didn't need to actually materialize it. Muds and moos, if you remember those things, right? These are text-based chat rooms which became incredibly rich in terms of their sort of creative evolution. But they were just text. There was no images, right? And the assumption is that everybody thinks or assumes naturally you need very high fidelity, you need a 3D room before you can have a conversation, and before you can have a fantasy about going into the forest, you need a 3D rendering of forest. No, Muds and Moos illustrated that you can do this just with text. So I think the human, and there's something about transferring that into the human brain or the human creativity, which I think is incredibly powerful. So constraints, yes. I would also say the flip side, right? I was talking with some developers about this yesterday. Like, technology, you have to build for the future. Like one of the things that was genius about Netscape is going back to that Web Louvre example, right? Like right at the beginning, is that they made the browser, early browser could render images really well. And a lot of people were like, that's really stupid. There are no images on the internet.
Mm.
There's like 5 places with images. And they were like, but we're building to the future. In the same way, I was saying to these founders yesterday, just spend on tokens. Because if you
Mm.
look at the cost of tokens today, it is plummeted, right? We're talking about like 500% in the last year in some areas of cost reduction. So you should just max your spend on tokens in every way, shape, or form. The foundation models are becoming a lot of and you should just assume that what you're paying today will be fractions tomorrow.
Okay,
So there's both constraint and spend. Yeah.
I want to poke at that. So I'm gonna okay. Betaworks founded, sort of like the studio model, et cetera, et cetera. But let me jump on what you were just talking about. One of the promises of AI from an investing standpoint, in terms of what's the business model, who are the winners going to be, is this sense of abundance potentially in terms of what it can achieve. Um, so explain to me your thinking as an investor or when you're advising companies right now in present day AI space. This what we're talking about, the tension of potential abundance versus the constraints economically or even resource wise.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you have this like sort of, you have this early days of the internet. You would just have this and use these metaphors to get there, but you have these like sort of sense that you've discovered a new land, right? And that there's an entirely new world that's opened up, and that you can build whatever you want in that new world, right? And then on the flip side is that you have some real constraints in terms of what you can do, what you're capable of doing with technology, what you can do, what capital you have, all those constraints. And so like balancing those things is like sort of one of the key jobs of the entrepreneur. But it's also, it is always, them keeping in mind sort of the higher order, like sort of like, why am I here? What am I actually building? I think is absolutely central to, ending up building things which matter and building things which change the world. So, do you want me to go further into that, or do you want me to go? You tell me because you asked a question which was sort of fast forwarding into the Betaworks world, so I can just
Yeah.
yeah.
So if you're advising someone that you're working with at Betaworks today, um, if it's you described virgin territory wide open versus the constraints and things like that, like what is the tension, how do you weigh that in terms of like go for abundance versus the constraints that allow you to make smarter decisions and be smarter about the startup that you're building?
Yeah, so it is. I mean, we're in a time right now. We're in a time of where it feels like there is endless abundance, and people, I will advise people, coach people to push people to like go for it because there's wide open territory right now. You think of the last 20. I view AI as being a successor technology to the internet. So it's being bootloaded by the internet. It is transforming the internet. And so I think that you can look at everything on the internet that will be that becomes AIified. And then you look at everything in the actual world that can be impacted once it becomes legible and to AI models in one way, shape, or form, right? Either through computer vision or through robots or through self-driving vehicles or through whatever. And so you could just see the breadth of abundance and of scope. And then on the flip side, The world right now is, I mean, we have a lot of challenges in our world, but in the world of tech in New York, there's a tremendous amount of activity, interest, building, creation. And I think that, the stage that we're at is that people are really starting to say, okay, what are the native properties of this medium? And how can I use this to actually build like radically new things, right? And we're thinking a lot today about next generation interfaces. We Last year, we were thinking a lot about agents. These are things which I think are going to radically transform the way we understand everything in the world, and the way the world is legible to us as human beings. That said, is that there will be a time when I don't foresee this tomorrow, but there will be a time when capital pulls back, and sort of these cycles of inherent in the business that we're all in the startup world, and particularly on the investor side, but inherent in the entire business is that you overshoot areas of investment, right? You go back to the early days of the internet. Part of the overshoot was they overbuilt in a lot of the infrastructure side. That in turn became incredibly valuable, all that fiber, once they could put it to good use. But it was, some of those companies like the WorldComs of the world just, overshot and overspent, and didn't end up managing the short-term realities of the business and their ability to raise capital, their ability to get debt, and to basically finance their business.
I want to end by talking about Betaworks. I keep calling it studio model or whatever, but it's like a clubhouse for founders. Like I've been to events there. Chris and I have invested in companies that have been through the Betaworks program or whatever. If you're a New York based startup right now, tell me what Betaworks can do for you, and who you're looking for and what you're excited about right now.
Yeah, yeah. So Betaworks is roots, right? You still buy photo logs. So I sold photo logs, started Betaworks in 2000, late 2007, 2008. And we started out, and most people know us as the sort of OG venture studio. So venture studio, I view it as kind of a suitcase word that different people put different things in the suitcase. And so you can sort of interpret what it is. In our case, we were always thesis first, right? We always had a view of the world. And our first 5 years, we spent a lot of time building and investing around the social web. So we were thesis first, and we raised some money into the venture studio to go build companies and to invest. And so, early things and wins we had at Betaworks is that had we were very interested in social web. We wrote the first check into Tumblr. There was a Twitter search engine that we worked with and then pivoted and then sold to Twitter, became Twitter search engine. And that was called
Twitterific.
Surmise. And then there was Twitterific, and there was TweetDeck, and we were very prolific and Twitterific around the Twitter ecosystem. And so we did a lot of things in the Twitter ecosystem. And then as that ecosystem shut down, we sold a lot of those things to Twitter, or we pivoted them, or some of them failed. We built things like Bitly, which became sort of like, sort of tools to use the social web. Heartbeat. We then moved to mobile and to do some fun things. We did Giphy, we did Dots, the game. So we built a bunch of things. In 2016, we made two decisions. The first is that the venture studio model that we've been running at that point there for about 8 years, we felt like that the market and specifically the New York tech market had become so active with founders that there were the sort of comparative edge that we had as being the place you would go to meet founders and build things, was changing, and that we needed to change. So we changed our approach. And so we took basically the best of the venture studio model, and we sort of brought it together with the accelerator model, the sort of YC accelerator model. And we started our thematic accelerators. Fast forward to today, we've done about close to 15 of them. The one which started 2 weeks ago is around AI interfaces. Did I mention agents before? We did the first half of last year, we did agents, then we did native AI apps. We've had a whole bunch of, we started doing AI machine learning stuff in 2016. our first camp, which Chris was involved with, I think, and he definitely came to speak at, was called Bar Camp,
Hmm.
and where we were looking at conversational interfaces, and Hugging Face was in that camp. And so, and then the second thing we also changed, which is kind of a detail, is we changed our capital structure, and it took a few years, but we sort of had a holding company structure, and then we moved into sort of a GPLP structure. So we sort of changed the engines behind Betaworks. But if you come to Betaworks today, we're down in Meatpacking. We had a fun event last night with some symbionts, so, with some artificial life, hanging out and chatting with them. We have a camping process now. We do a ton of events here. We still use it as a space to convene founders and bring founders together, and sort of a hub of activity around AI, machine learning, robotics, and sort of, I would say, deepish tech.
All I can say personally is that it's a great space, and I enjoy it every time I'm down there. John, Betaworks, all the great stuff from the history of the New York City tech scene. Thanks for coming on and remembering all that for us.
It was a pleasure.